Hi all, Mr. Finnerty here. So I'm just going to start recording lessons, explaining what you would have read in the book. Just for the time that we're going to be gone, reading the book is only going to get you so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly run through the sections that you would have read in the book and kind of just go into a little bit of explanation and go into why these are important for us to look over. So the first couple of things that I got you to look over were the Spartacist Uprising in 1919 and then the Kapp Putsch. So these two things are very important when we look at the Weimar Republic and how Germany was dealing after World War One and what way their country was. So the first one there, if we just look at the Spartacist Uprising, so obviously you would have looked at the Spartacist Uprising, you would have watched the videos and kind of gone over what yourselves would have thought about what was going on there at the time. And the main two people that were there involved in this were Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. So you would need to know those two people. And what's important, sorry, spelling and everything mightn't be 100% there, but what's important about the Spartacist Uprising was that the main two people involved had been part of the Social Democratic Party, but obviously they had broken away and formed their own kind of rogue group that where they got the name from was from Spartacus. Obviously, from we would have done ancient Rome from first to third year. Spartacus being the slave that led an uprising within Rome. And their main purpose here was trying to lead a socialist revolution. Socialism was there was a wave of socialism in Europe at the time, and they were kind of on this as well themselves. And what they wanted was a socialist government to take effect into Germany. So what they ended up forming was the German Communist Party, and we will be getting into communism a little bit later after this chapter. But I'm sure you all know a small little bit about communism. But they had formed the German Communist Party, and obviously the way Germany was was in that moment, they had felt that this was perfect time for an uprising. One had already occurred in Russia. A socialist government or communist government or party had taken over, and they had saw their opportunity to do the same thing as well too. So obviously it was Berlin is where they targeted strikes to organize around in public buildings. They tried barricading streets and places like that. They had weapons. They started riots. There was street fights. And obviously the Weimar government at the time knew that they couldn't let this happen. So they employed what were called free corps. And these free corps were, in German, Freikorps. Who were these people? These people were the men who were had come back from World War One. They were volunteer army units, and they wanted to crush this revolution or this uprising that was taking place. The main kind of, how would you put it? The main positive they had on their side was that the Spartacists were very unprepared. While they had weapons and they had barricades and everything set up, they weren't as prepared as what the Freikorps were. So eventually what would end up happening after this is you would have the death of about 100 Spartacists, okay, and the death then of about 13 Freikorps. So it was a bloody enough battle, but Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the two that we spoke about up here, the two socialists who led this, they were eventually killed for this. Other uprisings did take place. It wasn't just confined to Berlin. You had places like Bremen, Bavaria, Dusseldorf, but the same thing, Freikorps would go in and take them out easily enough. So it was the first kind of test that the Weimar government kind of faced. And it was really a test from an undemocratic left-wing uprising. Like they had went about it through undemocratic means by trying to take over Germany through force, except their unpreparedness was their downfall for this. The second main problem that the Weimar government faced was that of the Kapp Putsch. So at the time, the Treaty of Versailles, those main sections, the terms had been defined upon, and we'd looked at those before, and I'm sure you can all remember them: the B, R, A, and T, the blame, the reparations, the army, and the territory. And you do need to know that coming into this, when we talk about the Weimar government and why they felt there was some sort of wrongdoing by the Treaty of Versailles. So obviously the terms and the limitations that were put upon the German army, and the Freikorps as well too, that they'd end up being disbanded. And the term November criminals, we looked at that before, that the November criminals, this term was thrown around in Germany at the time, and the November criminals refers to the men in power who had sold the German people out. As we said, that at the time there was this notion of Dolchstoss, where the German people had felt stabbed in the back, that they had been continually told that, okay, we're going to win this war. However, all of a sudden we've surrendered, and now we have given ourselves that we are, number one, we are to blame. Number two, we have to pay back reparations of 6.6 billion. Our army is lowered, and our territory that we once had was gone. So a group of Freikorps then tried to set up another uprising, or a coup d'etat, and they, once again, where had they gone to? Only Berlin. And they had sought to kind of overthrow the Weimar democracy. And the main person that we'd spoke about here was Wolfgang Kapp. And Wolfgang Kapp, being the leader, he had the support of former army generals, one of the main ones being Ludendorff. And we will look over Ludendorff later when we talk about Hitler's own, his own kind of overthrow of the government. So the 11th of May, they marched 5,000 of these Freikorps into Berlin. And their aim then was to try and dissolve the National Assembly, the Weimar Constitution, and get rid of the government. They would then go to Dresden, on to Stuttgart, and they would then, Kapp's main aim was to try and set up the government in Berlin. So the army, I suppose, was called upon by the Weimar government at the time to try and take out these people. But the army refused, and as you would have seen from the video, the aim was that the German army doesn't fire upon German army, like former Freikorps soldiers. So it wasn't like the Spartacist uprising. They couldn't take them out with force because army members wouldn't fire upon their former friends or allies that they had fought with during World War I. So the idea then was to call a general strike of the workers. And the general strike then, they had hoped, would kind of bring Berlin to its knees, because no business would be able to take place, and all services would end up being ceased. And the end of it, what they had hoped, was that they would paralyze Berlin. And it was a smart idea because they had stopped any form of fighting taking place, and the idea that the German army wouldn't fire upon German soldiers. And this worked out perfectly because the workers united and resolved to try and defeat these counter-revolutionaries and Kapp. And those soldiers then, under Kapp's control, would find themselves isolated, and they didn't have the support of the people. And obviously, as I've mentioned before, that there was also a putsch in Munich, which was I'm sure you all remember from junior cert, was led by Adolf Hitler. Now, we're not going to go too much into detail about that. We're going to leave that until later on in the section. But this was something that there were two parts that the Weimar government had to deal with. So the Kapp Putsch and the Spartacist Uprising. What would come to cripple the Weimar government would eventually be its economy. Okay? So, as we've mentioned before, and we talked about that the Treaty of Versailles lay upon four main aims: BRAT, so blame and reparations, army, territory. Now, the reparations which we spoke about for the Russian or for the German people were very high. And if you can remember about the reparations, reparation meaning the money that they had to pay back for the damage that they had caused during World War One, because they had signed a war guilt clause, and the reparations was 6.6 billion pounds at the time, which, as we said, it wasn't until about 2010 until the final reparations were paid. Now, obviously, this would end up draining their economy. You had a lot of soldiers who had came home from World War One, and now all of a sudden the government has as a bill to pay back. How are they going to pay back this bill? The only way they're going to pay back this bill is through taxation. And when there's no work for people, taxes are going to have to be really put high. The German people were not prepared for that. So eventually, it would make their situation hopeless. And by 1921, they had paid back their first kind of part of the reparations bill, and it was £50 million. So they had paid back 50 million. And while that would seem great at the time, they were unable to pay any further installations of that as well too. This would lead to inflation, and because their inability to raise enough money through taxation, this inflation would be very rapid. Their foreign minister at the time, his policy was that we have to fulfill the Treaty of Versailles and we have to make some effort to face this crisis. A lot of people would brand this man a traitor, and he would eventually be assassinated in 1922. The new ministers that would come in, it would only get from bad to worse. They would look for a suspension of the payments, except this suspension wouldn't be granted because they had signed the war guilt clause. They were obliged to pay back this £6.6 billion. So when they couldn't pay it back, the French had become very annoyed about this. And what had ended up happening is that French and Belgian troops would go to a region in Germany called the Ruhr. Now, the Ruhr was an industrial region, and within this industrial region there was coal. And obviously that's a pretty big commodity at the time. And this is a commodity for the people. They feel that, if we take over this industrial region, we'll be able, therefore, to find some money from it. Except the Germans weren't happy about that, because they had saw this as an occupation, as a foreign government coming in and occupying German land. So the French and Belgian troops would go there in 1923, and the workers from the Ruhr were encouraged by the government to lead a kind of passive resistance. And the passive resistance being just go about your work, but do not help out these soldiers in the way. And if you have to, boycott. So stop any work at all. And you are not to help out these French or Belgian soldiers. If they're looking for raw materials and goods to be transported back to France or Belgium, you do not help them whatsoever. This would go on for a while, and from the Ruhr there was about 132 deaths of workers. And because of this then, when the strikers went on strike and boycott, obviously they have no wages coming in. And because they had no wages coming in, the German government had to pay their wages somehow. So the German government felt that they had to pay these workers' wages. Except what that would lead to then is, we talked about inflation. It would end up leading to hyperinflation. Hyperinflation being that the price of money in Germany would literally become worthless. It wouldn't be anything even close to the paper that it was printed upon. So like an example of that would be in 1920, $1 was 64 marks. Okay. Eventually then, by 1923, okay, $1 would end up getting you about 4 million marks. So what savings you had in Germany at the time were completely gone. So everything would be of a higher price now. And the only way to combat that would be that the German government, the Weimar government at the time, would have to start printing money. A couple of images over here that you can see on the right, that money would become so worthless that people would literally just use it to light fires. Kids would play with it. They would make kites out of it. You can see there the man on the bottom. He needs a cart to actually carry what would probably only be worth a few dollars, maybe. So, people would need suitcases, as it says in the book, full of marks to buy simple things like a loaf of bread. And as we said, the Ruhr invasion or occupation, the workers would continually be fighting back and forth. This would really highlight how ineffective the Weimar government was and how unprepared they were for this. So when it's at its highest, the middle class was ruined. Savings were now completely gone. So any savings that you had as a German, okay, were now gone. And the only people who were doing good from this was the industrialists and the landowners, because they could now pay off any loans. Their property went up, and some of them would eventually become, very, very wealthy off of this. And it would take a kind of a change in the direction the government was going in. They would need to make some changes, and those changes would come from Gustav Stresemann, which we'll look at now in a second. Gustav Stresemann was the man who kind of turned the German economy around and tried to help them live a better life. So this man here on the right is Gustav Stresemann, a one-time German chancellor. He only worked as a chancellor from August 1923 to November 1923. So Stresemann was mainly known as a foreign minister. That was a role that he kept until 1929. And his aim was to try and change the way people looked upon the Germans. He would always be referred to as the good German. I suppose because Germans had that notoriety about them now, because they were blamed for World War One, Stresemann would try and change that. He always tried to make Germany acceptable and respectable. As I said, that was his ideal, to be the good German. And he the first thing Stresemann asked to do was to end the conflict in the Ruhr, because number one, he knew that was giving Germany a bad name, and number two, he knew that they couldn't keep printing money for workers that weren't actually working. He would bring in tax reforms and try and reduce government expenditure, and any of the old German mark, he would call them back in. So any of that money that we looked upon, he would call it back in. So to bring in a brand new currency to kind of lower this inflation that had gone through the roof. The new mark, or the new German currency, will be called the Rentenmark. and this would help lower the German prices of things. So instead of having to pay 4 trillion marks for a loaf of bread, it was back down to a normal figure before. This would help control the German economy. And from the Rentenmark, then he would create a new bank called the Rentenbank to oversee this new currency. He really changed the German economy and kind of got it back on the track that they should have been idealing towards. So one of the revivals of the economy was from the Dawes Plan. And this is Charles Dawes over here. The Dawes Plan was brought about through an influx of foreign capital, mainly from America. So what would happen was that, number one, they would take away the conflict from the Ruhr. That was first part of the Dawes Plan. The second part of the Dawes Plan then was that they would be given a 2-year break from reparations. So they would be allowed 2 years of a break from paying the reparations to help their economy get back on track. The second thing then is they would receive $800 million from the US. This would help boost their economy, allow them to put into money into hospitals, public works, industries, and it would give the Germans that little bit of peace for a while, that they could help their economy prosper a little bit from the massive collapse from 1923 onwards. So the Dawes Plan was very, very successful for the Germans, and you can kind of see from this image, if you can see it down here, is that the US would give loans to Germany. Germany then could eventually pay back their reparations to Britain and France, and eventually then they would be able to give back war loans to USA. And what the USA had hoped as well from that is that the fact that Germany could pay back their reparations, Britain and France then would buy more American goods, which would then boost the American economy as well. Moving on then from the Dawes Plan was the Young Plan. And the Young Plan from down here was the idea of the Young Plan was to try and reduce the amount of reparations to about £2 billion. So they had hoped to reduce to £2 billion, or 2,000 million if you want, and try and make it that it'd be 59 years to pay back. This would be something that'd be good for the Germans because they wouldn't have that huge sum of 6.6 billion from the start that they had to pay back. But the problem was at this stage, and Stresemann himself would remark that they were living dangerously, the Germans, that the amount of loans that they had, and if you know anything about loans have to be what? They have to be paid back. And the amount of money that they were borrowing, Stresemann himself would quote that they were dancing on a volcano, i.e. that they were playing with fire. There was only so long they could go before they would be able to actually fail at some stage. So Stresemann, he brought back a lot of pride to the Germans. He brought back a lot of how would you say, commendation from other countries. They had saw that, this person had come through as foreign minister. He was helping the Germans out. He had brought about some sort of change. Inflation had gone down. They had approved loans. They had been dealing with other countries. And he knew that, as we said, he would say himself that they tried to get them back into the family of nations. You get this friendliness that they had once had back with other countries. And, the Locarno Pact in 1926, which you would have read about in your book, was something that would help this. It would help ease the tension between European states. So obviously involved in the Locarno Pact were Germany, Britain, France, Belgium and Italy. And what it would do, it was that Germany would accept existing frontiers. So they would accept the frontiers that had been drawn upon and that they had agreed to these. What it would also do is that it would allow Germany to enter the League of Nations. Sorry. And if you can remember from Junior Cert, the League of Nations was not very popular. And one of the big things then, it would demilitarize the Rhineland. And obviously the demilitarized Rhineland was recognized and Allied troops would withdraw from this. It would help them, be part of the League's council. And Stresemann himself would, from back up here, Stresemann would end up getting the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926. Not on his own, he would end up sharing it with Adrist Briand, who will later learn, or you can remember from Mussolini, was part of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war as an instrument for solving political differences. And Germany was part of that as well too. So the problem then that occurred for Germany at this time was that Gustav Stresemann, unfortunately, he died of a heart attack in 1929. And this was very, very bad for the German people because he had done so much for the country, but at the same time there was so much to be done. And obviously there was a vacuum in German politics, and that was something that was not going to be easily filled. So what led then to the collapse of the Weimar Republic was that in 1929, well, first of all, because Stresemann wasn't there, and we had said here that Stresemann had said we were dancing on a volcano, that the amount of loans we have to pay back are very high, they're helping us out, but if anything was to go wrong, we're going to fall into this volcano. So what would end up happening is that obviously in 1929, which we can see down here, we have the Wall Street crash. And the Wall Street crash leads to a massive crash in stocks, which, as it says here from the image, that billions of dollars were lost. This would in turn lead to the Great Depression. And this was, I suppose, a nail in the coffin for the Weimar Republic. Because if we can remember, we have our two pacts that were signed. We have the Dawes Pact and we also have the Young Pact. Where does that money come from? That money comes from the USA. And if USA is going through a depression of itself, where do they need that money from? They need that money paid back, or they're just going to stop the funds going through. Those funds would eventually be stopped, and Germany would go through a horrible time during the Great Depression. About 6 million people would end up being unemployed in Germany at the time. And the conditions by 1932, the poverty, the depression, the despair, all it would take is a revolutionary force to come through and to highlight this horrible time that Germany was going through. Because at the time, people had felt, that, from 1923 onwards, that, when they had the Kaiser in charge, when they had the German Empire, things were better. But all of a sudden now they've went through hyperinflation, a few years of peace, working back the reputation that they had lost, only for it all to come crashing down during the Wall Street crash in 1929. And as I said, these conditions were perfect. Hitler would eventually take over a large number of seats in the Reichstag. He would eventually become Chancellor, and he would use this role then to eventually become the dictator of Germany. So that's just a kind of quick recap. The next lesson that I'm going to upload, we're going to talk about Heinrich Brüning, the Hunger Chancellor, and what conditions, what further conditions, and what actions did Hitler use to kind of become this new dictator within Germany, which leads us into our next section. So if you have any questions, please message me on Teams. Look back over this. This is just a quick recap of everything that the work you've done yourself during this break. I just feel it's a bit easier for me to record these, explain things, and maybe for you to just listen to it, watch it, just to get a quick recap. All right. So thanks. Should be able to have the next lesson up in the next couple of days. All right. Bye bye.